Welcome back to the channel. In the last video, we chatted about CB antennas back in the heyday of CB, when CB was really popular, how many antennas were available. I mean, you could walk into Radio Shack and get them. They were just everywhere. So this time around, I thought we'd follow that up by talking about some of the radios that were available back in the day, specifically in the late 70s, early 80s, when I was into CB pretty heavy. So that's what this video is going to be about. And this list is in no particular order, although I will put what I consider to be the top dog at the #1 spot. But these are just the radios that I heard on the air, and many of them I owned myself. And ironically, my current CB radio base station that I have, it didn't make the list. Although my 142 is a great radio, there were other radios that were more popular back in the 80s. So I tried to cover the most popular radios, the most sought-after radios that existed back in the early 80s, late 70s, when CB was very, very popular. And this list comes with a caveat. Many of these radios are not Part 95 accepted radios. Many of them are export radios. Many of them were not legal to be used on the CB channels. But I'm just sharing what I heard on the air back then. And before we get into this list, I probably should define what free banding is, because that's what many of these radios were capable of doing. So many of these radios were free band radios, or export, quote unquote, export radios that would go below channel 1 and above channel 40. And back in the day, back in the 80s, even the 70s, it was common to modify CB to do this, to go above channel 40 or below channel 1. And the reason, mostly the reason that happened, is because by then CB had gotten so popular and was so crowded that it was just simply hard to hold a conversation on channels 1 through 40. You would get people walking all over you. You would get morons who would come in and jam you on purpose. So the solution that many CBers come up with was just to modify their radios so they would go out of band, so they could find a clean space to have a communication. So obviously not legal, but the FCC was pretty lax in enforcing freebanders. And for the most part, if you didn't attract attention and you didn't cause complaints, the FCC left you alone. Still not legal, of course, but that's just what was going on back in the day, and I assume still going on to this day. But anyway, let's get to the list. So the first radio that I'm going to talk about is the Courier Caravel. And the only reason that this radio made this list is because I've heard them on the air, and the transmit audio is simply fantastic. They're AM only, they're all transistor, they were built in the 70s, and the transmit audio quality is just very, very good. So that's the only reason that this radio is on the #10 spot, is because I've heard them on the air, and they were very good radios as far as transmit audio goes. #9 on the list. This was my second radio. My first radio was an old tube top Lafayette. It actually had plug-in crystals. Many of you may not realize, but in the very, very early days of CB, you had to buy crystals for the channels that you wanted to transmit on, like this. So this is a channel 11 transmit crystal. And this is a channel 11 receive crystal. And if you wanted to operate on a certain channel, you actually had to purchase crystals, transmit and receive crystals, so your radio would actually work there. That was my first radio ever. I didn't have it for very long, and then I moved on to this radio, the Realistic Navaho TRC30A. This radio makes the list not only because it was my first real 23-channel AM base station, but because these things were everywhere. They were so prolific that you could find them for $20-30 in the classifieds. They were just everywhere. This was kind of like the Ford Escort of radios. You couldn't look through the newspaper without seeing one of these for sale. They were just everywhere. So very, very popular radio. It wasn't really outstanding in any one way, but they worked well, and they were very cheap, and it was a good first radio to get on the air. #8 on the list, SBE Trinidad. So every time I heard one of these radios on the air, I just remarked how good the audio quality was. This was a really good radio. It was kind of a high-end radio, had an all wooden cabinet, and they were very good as far as transmit audio. This was also an AM only radio, but very good on-air transmit quality, and I heard quite a few of them on the air. Very good radio. Number 7 on the list, a DAK Mark IX radio. I actually owned one of these radios briefly. It was AM only. I bought it mostly for the looks. I thought that it was the best looking CB that I'd ever laid eyes on, and many people feel the same way. It was big on bling, but not really that big on zing. It didn't really wow you in any other area other than its looks. So I briefly owned one of these, and it made the list mainly because of its looks. There was a sideband version of this radio as well, but it wasn't as good as the AM only radio. They did have good transmit audio, I do remember that, but other than that, I didn't have it very long because at that time I was already looking for sideband radios, so this was just kind of a stepping stone into one of those. Number 6, the Yaesu FT101E, and already I can hear the hams screaming. Why would you put a ham radio on a CB related video? Well, it's because this particular radio would go on AM, and there was a lot of CBers that would buy FT101Es, put an 11-meter crystal in it, and use it on 11 meters. And I heard many of them on the air. Illegal? Absolutely. But they have absolutely fantastic transmit audio on AM and, of course, on sideband. Still one of the bucket list radios for many hams. It was a hybrid radio. It was solid state on the receive side, and the finals were tubes. But very good radio, obviously not legal to use on CB, but many people did anyway, and still do to this day. A lot of hams will avoid these radios just because they feel they may have been used by CBers and abused on AM, but very good radio. Number 5, the Sonar FS2340. I had a friend that had one of these radios, and it had very, very good transmit audio. It was also an AM only rig, but the transmit audio was just fantastic, and they had a very good reputation back in the day, so I included it on this list. The Siltronix 1011D. This was a radio that was made by Swan Corporation, which was a producer of ham radios, but they branched out, created a new label, Siltronix, for the export CB market. And this was basically a 10-meter rig that was modified to go to 11 meters. And these were also very good on the air as far as transmit audio goes. It's a tube rig and also a sideband rig. And they had a reputation for drifting. This was a radio that you had to turn on hours before you planned to use it to get it to stabilize, or else it would drift all over frequency. I have seen these in use. I've never owned one, but they do have extremely good transmit audio on both AM and sideband. Once again, not Part 95 accepted. This is an illegal radio to use on 11 meters, but many people use them on the air and probably still do. Tram D201A. This is a Tram D201. The D201A is very similar. This was a very, very good sounding radio on the air. They had reliability issues, heat problems. It was hard to find one in good condition, but everyone that I heard on the air sounded fantastic. This was a sideband radio, and this is a good radio if you're a collector and you want to find an old project to pick one of these up and restore it, because they do sound wonderful on the air. This would be a good rig to convert to 10 meters, use it on 10 meters. Number 2 on the list is most of these radios that I've mentioned so far were made in the 70s. This one was made in the very late 70s and got very popular in the 80s. This is the Cobra 2000 GTL. So as far as base stations in the 80s, this was top dog. And once again, many of these radios were modified to freeband. And they had probably the best feature of this radio was its awesome AM receive. This had a dual conversion AM receiver on it. Also had a built-in frequency counter, and was considered to be the top dog. for many, many, many years. And on sideband, they were very good. The transmit audio on AM and sideband was very good. And I never owned one of these because by then, by the time this radio had started to get popular, I was kind of abandoning AM and I was going to sideband, and ended up with a 142 GTL, which doesn't have as good AM receive or AM transmit, but on sideband, it is very, very similar. The circuitry is very similar to this Cobra 2000 GTL. So, and the 2000 GTL was about twice as expensive as the 142. So, but still, top dog for many, many years. Still a very sought after radio. And honorable mention is going to be the President Madison, which is essentially almost exactly the same circuitry. This was a dual conversion AM receiver as well. The circuitry wasn't exact, but it was very close. So this radio operated very, very much like the 2000 GTL. Number one on my list of the most sought after radios from the 80s and from the 70s is going to be the Browning Golden Eagle Mark III. This radio, if you ever heard anybody transmit with this radio, you instantly recognized it because this radio was a separate transmitter and receiver, and when you keyed the microphone, the received would not disconnect immediately, and you would get a momentary feedback. The Golden Eagle guys call it a ping, but it was basically feedback. So whenever somebody would key one of these radios, it would have a momentary ping or squeal and let everybody on the frequency know exactly what they were transmitting on. It was actually a design flaw, but Browning left it in because many people liked that feature. It was kind of a calling card. When you keyed this radio up and you heard that ping, you knew what they were transmitting on. So this was a very expensive radio, very high-end radio. Once again, it's not Part 95 accepted. It's a free band radio. It's an export radio, but very expensive in its day. Most people could not afford this radio, much like the Tram D201A. It was out of reach of most people, but whenever you heard one on the air, and I heard them on the air quite often back in the day, and they are very, very warm on sideband and AM, and they're also a tube rig. So fantastic radio, fantastic audio. If you ever hear one on the air, you would immediately take notice. So this is number one on my list, the Browning Golden Eagle Mark III, tops of my list today. And obviously, many of you will have differing opinions on some of these radios. If you have any suggestions of radios that you know of that I might have missed, please put them in the comments below. And thanks for watching.